yes, we're growing, our stock price is at all-time highs, but we're still going to lay off a lot of people that are not with that program. And so I think a lot of people should be nervous in tech land right now because companies are using that AI excuse not just to grow their stock price, but to thin their ranks. And even as they're making more money and seeing more stock market value, they're trimming their ranks. And that's a rough thing to see.
Hey, Scott. Been quite a week this week. I mean, Wednesday was crazy. In terms of financial data, everything that we thought was going just fine just went topsy-turvy. Inflation up 3.5%. Did anyone see that one coming?
Yeah, I think at this point, inflation that's lower than, remember, we were up around 7 or 8%, which was the highest we'd seen since the Reagan years. And that really kicked off a lot of concern and talk of a possible recession. At this point, I think what most economists will tell you, not to mention most people who have jobs, granted, not everybody does. A lot of people are struggling when they go to the grocery store. But I think what most people would tell you is that our economy is really strong. Job growth is up, wage growth is up, the stock market is up. People are still spending a lot of money. And when that happens, it's inflationary. And that really makes it tough, I think, for the Fed to justify a rate cut, which so many on Wall Street want to see because the economy is still pretty hot.
Yeah, and in fact, they're saying now a lot of folks are saying no rate cut this summer. But some, real negative folks are saying maybe not one this year. Not an election year. Just leave things as they are. Let them settle out in some way. I know the market, Dow Jones fell 450 points on the news in a matter of minutes. It's interesting where the inflation hit. Housing, of course, gas. We know that especially in California. Food, not as much, though meat went up and car insurance rates went up. I mean, it kind of an interesting, crazy quilt of inflationary movement. What do you think about all that? Does it mean anything? Can we derive anything from that?
And that's a great question because I think that's something we cannot do is try to establish what this all means because of these seemingly scattershot ways that inflation is going up. Now, gas, especially here in California, is creeping up again. But remember when gas was $7.50 a gallon out here on the West Coast, we could pretty much point to that and housing and say, hey, sorry, entire United States, we're really causing inflation with energy prices and housing prices. Now, of course, housing prices are stable and very high still, but gas prices have come down. Food prices remain high. I don't understand enough about what numbers mean or the economy means to know why car insurance is high. That feels like car insurance companies are gouging people. But again, I don't know. And why something random like that, I just can't figure out how to, label this. We're still not at 2% inflation. We're higher than that. And that's what the Fed wants to see before it cuts rates. And I don't know how, with these random things jumping as they are, we get to 2% inflation in the near term, just because so many parts of the economy are still running hot.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. Food seems to be, gasoline obviously is the thing that angers people, but food seems to be the big one. And I think it's because people have a memory of what prices were and the buying power of cash at a supermarket. One economist just did a survey and said of a typical shopping cart of 32 items 4 years ago, you would have to take out 10 items to pay the same amount. Now that's a visceral kind of thing. You know that. And I hear more muttering from people talking about the price of eggs than I do about, the price of cars right now. They remember egg prices.
That makes sense because, I don't know, as someone who does shop a lot, you check the price overall. And when that starts to get higher and higher, you start looking at individual items, like why all of a sudden is my regular grocery bill that much higher? And then when you start to see that over time, you start to look specifically and you realize, well, it's eggs or it's bread or it's milk. And that's how we get these figures. And you're right, it does feel like the government is powerless to do anything about this. And we know they're not entirely powerless, but we've seen a lot of interest rate hikes, and we've seen the mortgage rate go back up to 7%, and we're still paying a lot for our groceries. So I understand that frustration, because it is something that you check every time you get that receipt.
Yeah, and it just, I was looking at the numbers and it struck me, the biggest victims of all this are people on keto diets, because it's eggs and meat and all that.
Right.
Vegetarians, that stuff's getting cheaper. Carbohydrates, bread and all that, it held pretty steady. But if you're trying to live like a caveman, you're paying a lot of money right now.
I guess so. You're right. I hadn't thought of that. Although, yeah, it feels like prices have been overall high for a long time. And I remember eggs came down, even gas came down. And I don't know how much of this is just flat out frustration. I think a few weeks back, you and I talked about how in a seemingly overall really good economy, why are so many people upset? And that's, I think, a legitimate question. But there are people who I don't know how to please them, and I don't know exactly what needs to be done. But the Fed is still saying lowering interest rates right now in such a hot economy doesn't make sense. And if you look at least in the near future, it's hard to see, barring some black swan, the economy taking a big hit all of a sudden.
And in fact, the economy seems in certain areas, if you're a tech worker in Silicon Valley right now, if you haven't been laid off because you're not an AI person, NASDAQ just hit a record high Thursday. So bad news, the Dow Jones slumps on Wednesday. NASDAQ, all the tech stocks, hit a record high on Thursday.
Well, there are now more places where you can invest in AI, because companies are trying to come out of the woodwork, almost 1999 style, and saying, hey, we're an AI company. And it's working for some companies.
By the way, that happened today with Amazon. Did you see that the CEO of Amazon predicted the future, saying AI is going to lead us into a magical world we can't even imagine? And Amazon stocks went right through the roof.
Right. And Apple also had its biggest day in months, because it said, hey, we're going to get into AI. It's actually using those letters, which it didn't do for a long time. Yeah. And I think the AI rush is dangerous for workers, because remember the companies like Meta that got more efficient with AI by saying we're going to focus on AI, and they laid off tens of thousands of people. Google did the same thing, saying we're really going to focus on AI. Yes, we're growing. Our stock price is at all-time highs, but we're still going to lay off a lot of people that are not with that program. And so I think a lot of people should be nervous in tech land right now, because companies are using that AI excuse not just to grow their stock price, but to thin their ranks. And even as they're making more money and seeing more stock market value, they're trimming their ranks. And that's a rough thing to see.
I should mention among the layoffs, there's been a few, but while we were gone, Apple cut 600 jobs on its car project. And we know that, Ghost Autonomy has laid off some people. Intel has laid off, it's 62 positions. I mean, you got to look at the denominator of that. It's like 100,000. So 62 isn't a lot, but it's still interesting to see companies laying off during a time like this, when they should be going very well. Let's see. Compared to last year, Intel cut 7,000 jobs last year. So that gives you a feel, but still, that's layoffs. And it's kind of interesting to see them happening at a time like this. I can see Ghost Autonomy, it laid off 100 people, but self-driving cars, technology whose time hasn't come, as we know. So these seem to be more like just cleanup right now than actual layoffs. They're being presented as that. but it's nothing like last year. I don't see any indication we're going to see any massive layoffs. Do
Right.
you?
I mean, I think the term you use is a good one. It is cleaning up. It's saying we're focusing on AI. We're going to use that as an excuse. And we're not seeing the machines take over for people as much as we are seeing companies cut people to make room for AI as their focus. But that's just round one. What happens in accounting and writing and data processing, et cetera, when the machines do take over? Because we hear these companies in banking too, where they say, you know, I can use one AI bot and
Yeah.
it'll do the work of 70 people. That's horrifying. And I don't really know when that starts to kick in. But the promise of AI, to me, hasn't quite been reached. I think it's still very hyped. There's a lot of exciting things, but if you use ChatGPT enough, you see, I don't know, the writing just isn't human yet. It's not that quality to me.
No, but for gathering information, it's
Yes. Yes.
and in something like fintech, which you don't need a lot of communication skills, I would think it would be revolutionary in a very short time.
That I agree with. And that could cost a lot of jobs because it is more efficient to do that via a machine.
Absolutely. Reporting season starts again tomorrow, Friday, and it's right now it's just Wells Fargo and Morgan Stanley, but we're going to see the tech companies coming in the next few weeks. What do you think? Are you feeling good about this? Are you hearing good numbers, preliminary numbers out there?
You know, the preliminary numbers I think are going to be goosed a bit by the layoffs that we've been talking about. As far as profits, I don't know. It's hard to say because I know Tesla has pretended to be a tech company for, a couple of decades now. But its numbers for deliveries were very much lower than expected. Does that mean people are buying less tech, or are they just buying fewer Teslas than expected? So I think the bottom lines will be goosed a bit by the layoffs. But as far as profits, I'm not sure because the last round, just a quarter ago, some of the companies, even those that reported good numbers, said the future is a bit cloudy. They couldn't project all that much. Now we'll know why, if indeed they were looking into some sort of slow time.
Okay. An interesting story's developed in the last couple weeks, which is NVIDIA is finally starting to see potential competitors. And in this case, it's big competitors. Meta and Google both seriously announced their commitment to AI and building in-house chips, AI chips. Now that's a direct assault. It's not customer fighting over customers. It's literally fighting over the core technology in semiconductor, which NVIDIA has owned for several years now.
Yeah, and they're likely to own it for a little while. They were on this so early that they had a huge lead. But look, what's better than competition? And all the companies you named are American companies. I mean, isn't the big battle supposed to be with China? And so far, we've seen Google, their stock is at all-time highs because of AI. NVIDIA obviously ripping it up. We've seen Supermicro, even Meta all-time highs as they get into as they get into AI. Apple jumped something like $7-8 on Thursday when they announced an AI initiative. Just on Thursday, a Japanese company called Rapidus saying they're going to open a Santa Clara office and build high-powered computer chips in agreement, in some sort of a partnership with America. This is America and Japan working together on the hottest technology in the world right now. And that kind of flattens things out. And so competition is good. Sure, if it cuts into NVIDIA's bottom line, those guys are still going to do fine. They're going to be able to buy groceries. But for other companies to do it means AI startups might get a little bit of a discount on chips, which means they'll grow faster and more powerfully. And that bodes well for American business.
Moore's Law is still going, despite all the predictions that it was over. Every once in a while, you get just sort of taken aback when you read a figure describing the impact of Moore's Law. I just read a couple days ago, the new NVIDIA AI chips have 200 billion transistors. Now, I'm old enough to remember when it was exciting when 16K went to 32K. 200 billion. you're down there in the world of quantum effects where the walls are bumpy with molecules and atoms. This is an extraordinary achievement. I mean, you have to step back every once in a while and go, we live in one of the most extraordinary times in human history. The idea that you could put 200 billion of anything into a square the size of a baby's fingernail is mind-boggling. And these guys are now competing over who can get to the next step. And we have three of the biggest companies in history. In fact, Google, its stock has hit a all-time high. It is just short now of joining the $2 trillion club. We have these gigantic companies producing items by the billions. Every one of them is more complicated than the Manhattan Project. It's beyond human comprehension in some ways. We look at B's and T's, and we operate as if we know what a trillion actually looks like. I just wanted to throw that in because it just blew my mind.
No, it makes sense. I mean, that companies are doing these in-house chip projects and doing it with such power and such speed is incredible because the semiconductor
and they're not
business,
even chip companies.
Right, exactly.
It used to be the kiss of death. A regular manufacturer would buy a semiconductor company in the 70s and 80s, saying that they're going to bring it in-house and compete that way. They all died. It never worked. It never worked to have an operation in-house. Now it seems to be a casual decision.
Yeah, and you see these companies benefit from it. You see the chip equipment makers all of a sudden back in style and benefiting from this. It's a surprising turn of events because of what you just said, but also it shows semiconductors are once again the belle of the ball, and that's what everybody wants, these super high-powered chips that can power the latest AI innovations.
By the way, they think that AI servers will consume about 50% of the electricity in the United States by 2030. I mean, if we don't start improving our power grid, this is going to stop. We can't keep moving this fast. It's just sucking up all the electricity on Earth.
Right. I mean, ChatGPT will help you on your resume. The bad news is you won't be able to charge your car to get to the job interview. So it's sort of a trade-off.
I should mention that the companies that are now in the $2 trillion club would be once Alphabet joins, Alphabet, Microsoft, Apple, and NVIDIA. Now,
Right.
When we started this podcast, we were talking about the very first $1 trillion company. Now we've got, 4 of them, and they're $2 trillion. And I have a feeling while we're still doing this podcast, we'll be talking about the $4 trillion club. It's extraordinary. Okay. Finally, we got to get into this one because did you cover this on the news that a California state assemblyman in San Francisco has introduced a bill that sets constraints on work hours where a company could be fined if a manager calls an employee during off work hours. Now, I was on the BBC again last night, and that was one of the first things they asked me about. I didn't realize this, but there's 16 countries around the world that already have that rule. The latest being Australia. And they had a woman reporter on from Australia talking about it. And she said they really hadn't felt the effect of it yet, but she senses it's going to be kind of interesting because it's sort of like the government inserting itself into employee manager relations inside of companies. And then they asked me, what kind of effect do you think this will have on Silicon Valley? And I said, none. It'll be roundly ignored. And where it's not ignored, companies will just tell their employees, your new employment contract states that we can call you anytime, day or night, or on the weekend. And they said, well, won't that be onerous? And I said, I invite you to Silicon Valley to drive through the parking lots of businesses on a Sunday morning and see how many of those parking lots are actually full. Those people aren't being told to come in. They're volunteering. That's, it's a cutthroat business and everybody works extra hours and you answer your boss's call at 1 a.m. if he calls.
Yeah, I mean, my pushback would be a bit on this. Some of those employees are being told to come in on a Sunday or late at night. Let's be honest. Yeah. I was just in Australia, actually, and people were talking about this and talking about how great of an idea this was. And so it got me thinking, and then came back. And then within a couple of weeks of me coming back from Australia, people here were talking about it. I think the benefit of something like this overall is work-life balance. We know that a better work-life balance leads to more productivity. And, this goes to all of the sexist companies in the past that wouldn't, hire a woman executive. Oh, you might get pregnant and need time off. Come to find out, companies that do allow good maternity leave and even paternity leave are more profitable. Oh my goodness. So it turns out if you allow people to have a life outside of work, they feel better about work and they're more productive. Now, I know this goes against a certain Silicon Valley startup ethos, but it is interesting to think about at least the kind of, world where when you leave the office, you're not going to get 20 emails or texts or phones from the office. Again, very few of us know what that's like. But, I don't know. I work at a place that does value the work-life balance.
Right.
And okay, we do communicate a lot, maybe in off hours. But when people are off, they're off. And managers are very thoughtful about that. And when people are sick, they're off until they get better. And people are thoughtful about that if they're taking a maternity or paternity leave. And that is, I realize, fortunate. It shouldn't be fortunate. It should just be built in because that's what builds loyalty and workers excited to be in the office. And I think we're going to see a shift one way or another, depending on whether we demand people even come back to the office. But that's probably going to be decided first before we tell people, hey, don't worry, your phone's not going to ring when you leave work. That's kind of maybe a world away from Silicon Valley.
Look, I was one of those guys walking behind the Little League backstop doing a business call while my sons were playing ball. I mean, I got all the way deep into that, but the last 30 years, I don't answer phone calls most of the time. Send me an email. I'll look at it when I feel like it. Now, that's the life of a freelancer, but I think that people have developed a lot of skills at not doing work all night long because the boss might call. People turn off the ringers on their phone. If you have a boss that's bad, and I've exposed guys like that, almost on the verge of criminal behavior of exploitation of workers, quit. Ultimately, your work-life balance is in your own hands. And if you let your boss become your master, then you've entered into servitude. Walk away.
I mean, it's not that easy. It's not that easy.
But bringing the government in to monitor this, and once you get fines, then you're going to get suits. I mean, my attitude, government tends to, when it inserts itself into the commercial world, it tends to screw everything up.
Right. I won't argue there, but it is hard for a lot of people to walk away from a lot of jobs. It's hard for a lot of people to have that private time. Those of us who do feel that there is a separation, I think, are in the lucky, I don't know if it's minority, but we're fortunate. And why shouldn't everybody be able to go on a vacation without thinking about the office? Again, it has been shown that that leads to a more productive workplace. And so I'm interested to see where this goes. But I admit, if you're young and you're in a Silicon Valley startup, you're in it to be in it 24/7. I get that. I mean, that's an excitement, and I get it. So I don't know where the twain will meet, but I don't think we're going to wipe out the calls away from home anytime soon, at least in this part of the world.
Well, with the reports of the shortages of skilled top workers, this could be actually a competitive edge that companies might offer.
Okay, but what if they first offer more vacation or more family leave or better healthcare plans or just flat out higher wages, people will flock to those offices. And now I think they have an arrow in their quiver, as everybody else seems to be saying you have to come back to the office.
Yeah.
What about the startup or even medium-sized company that says, you can work away from the office? People might even jump at that because they got used to that, and that really helped them in their work-life balance as well.
Yeah, and in my experience, the people that worked at home were actually more productive in terms of actually doing something than people that go to the office, who devote a lot of the day to not doing something. So we'll see. It's California Assembly. The odds of it actually becoming law are probably pretty slim, but we'll see. We'll track this as we go along. Okay, well, it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
I'm glad you had a great time in Australia. That was cool.
Yeah.
That's it for now, folks. You can find us on Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. You can see Scott on Facebook and X, and of course, almost every weeknight on NBC Bay Area. And me occasionally almost everywhere in the world on the BBC World Radio show Business Matters. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Enjoy the warm weather. Bye-bye.